The strap hit her throat before she could scream. Two men, big, fast, and completely indifferent to the 30 people watching, dragged Nora Voss across the cafeteria floor of Harlan Vale Medical Center while trays clattered and someone's coffee cup shattered against the tile. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. One of the attackers pressed his mouth close to her ear and said, very quietly, that she was going to tell him where the patient in Trauma Bay 4 was, or she wasn't going to get up off this floor. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman he was choking had once pulled a bleeding man out of a burning vehicle under live fire in a country most people couldn't find on a map. And somewhere outside, a black SUV had just turned into the emergency entrance. If this story already has you holding your breath, follow along, hit like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The morning had started the way most of Nora's mornings started, badly and early. She had been on since 6, which meant she had already fielded 2 combative patients before the cafeteria even opened, charted 4 intake assessments with a keyboard that kept dropping the letter D, and eaten half a granola bar she'd found in her locker from sometime last week. The expiration date was a question she had chosen not to investigate. Harlan Vale Medical Center sat on the industrial edge of Caldwell City, not the part of Caldwell that made the tourism pamphlets, but the part with the freight yards and the bail bond offices and the 24-hour pharmacies that had bulletproof glass at the counter. The hospital served everyone, the insured, the uninsured, the people who came in on gurneys with no ID, and the people who came in with lawyers waiting in the lobby. It was a real hospital, which meant it was understaffed, underfunded, and running on the collective stubbornness of people like Nora who hadn't yet found a better option. Nora Voss was 28 years old. On paper, she was an ER nurse with 4 years at Harlan Vale, decent evaluations, and a reputation for being difficult, which, in practice, meant she asked too many questions, pushed back on attending physicians when she thought they were wrong, and had once filed a formal complaint against a charge nurse who she believed had falsified a medication log. That complaint had gone nowhere. The charge nurse, a man named Dillard, who wore short sleeves year-round to show off his CrossFit arms, was still working the desk. Nora was still working the floor. What her file didn't say, what almost nothing in her current life said, was that before Harlan Vale, before Caldwell City, before the granola bars and the sticky keyboard, Nora had spent 6 years as an Army combat nurse attached to a forward surgical team operating in some of the more unpleasant corners of the world. She had done 2 deployments. She had treated wounds that most civilian trauma surgeons would never see in a 30-year career. She had carried a rifle. She had on 2 specific occasions that she did not discuss, done things that fell outside the standard definition of medical support. She had left the Army honorably, quietly, and with a collection of commendations she kept in a shoebox in the back of her closet. She didn't talk about them. She didn't display them. When new coworkers asked about her background, she said she had done some travel nursing before settling in Caldwell City, which was technically not a lie. The ER that morning was a standard chaos. A construction worker with a nail through his palm, a woman in her 60s who had been having chest pain for 3 days before her daughter finally forced her into a car. 2 college kids from the university across town who had done something inadvisable with a bottle rocket. Nora moved between them with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned, years ago, that panic was a resource you couldn't afford to waste. It was around 9:15 when she first noticed the patient in Trauma Bay 4. He had come in overnight before her shift started, flagged as a GSW, gunshot wound, with a security hold on his room and a notation in the system that said, restricted access, federal case, contact charge desk before entry. Nora had seen federal holds before. Caldwell City was a corridor city, positioned between 2 larger metros, and it got its share of people who had witnessed things or survived things that made them temporarily interesting to federal investigators. The patient in Trauma Bay 4 had a different feel to him, though. There were 2 men in the hallway outside his room who were not wearing hospital IDs. They wore plain clothes and had the specific kind of stillness that came from training rather than boredom. Nora noted it and moved on. Not her case, not her bay, not her problem. She ate the rest of the granola bar at 9:40. By 10:15, she was in the cafeteria on her first real break of the morning, standing at the coffee station and staring at the machine with the focused resentment of someone who had been betrayed by it before. "It's been out of the dark roast since Tuesday," said a voice behind her. One of the dietary techs, a young guy named Marcus, who she recognized but couldn't name, shrugged apologetically. "The medium blend is actually okay if you add enough sugar." "I don't do medium anything," Nora said. She settled for black, found an empty table near the windows, and sat down with her back to the wall, out of a habit so old she didn't think about it anymore. The cafeteria at Harlan Vale was large and institutional, long rows of tables, overhead fluorescents that buzzed when the HVAC kicked on, a serving line that featured the same rotating cast of 5 entrees. It was maybe a third full at this hour, a mix of hospital staff and a few family members of patients who had drifted down looking for something to do with their hands. She was on her second sip when the door from the main corridor swung open and 2 men walked in who were wrong in a way she clocked immediately. Not wrong in an obvious way. They weren't running. They weren't shouting. They came in like they belonged, which was exactly the kind of wrong she had learned to notice. The larger of the two, heavy-set, jacket despite the heat, moving with his chin slightly down, swept the room in a way that had nothing to do with finding a table. The second man was younger, leaner, and stayed near the door like he was thinking about exits. Nora set down her coffee. The larger man walked directly to the serving line counter and spoke to one of the dietary workers, a woman named Phyllis, who had worked the cafeteria for 11 years and wore reading glasses on a beaded chain. Nora couldn't hear what he said. She watched Phyllis's face change, a rapid compressing sequence from neutral to confused to frightened. Phyllis shook her head. The man said something else. Phyllis took a step back and hit the edge of the serving counter. Nora was already standing up. She didn't run. Running in a hospital meant something specific. It caused the kind of contagious alarm that made situations worse. She walked fast, angling toward the serving counter from the side. And she was still about 15 feet away when the larger man reached over the counter, grabbed Phyllis by the wrist, and pulled her halfway across the sneeze guard. Someone screamed. The room went rigid. "Hey!" Nora's voice came out flat and carrying. Both men turned. "Let go of her." The larger man looked at her with the particular blankness of someone who had already categorized her and filed her under not a problem. He released Phyllis's wrist, but only because he was already redirecting. He moved around the end of the serving counter with the speed of someone who had done this kind of thing before. And before Nora could back up, he had a hand on her shoulder and was rotating her hard into the counter edge. The impact caught her mid-back and sent a spike of pain up her spine. She didn't go down. She got an elbow into his ribs. Not a clean hit, more of a deflection. And for a second she had space to breathe. Then the second man was there. And he had a length of heavy nylon strap, a serving cart restraint, the kind used to secure carts during transport. And she registered what was happening about a half second before it happened. The strap went around her throat from behind. She got her chin down fast enough that it wasn't flush against her airway, which bought her a few seconds of breath. But the man behind her knew what he was doing, and he was adjusting, pulling the slack out, and the room was cycling through its own private collapse. Trays hitting the floor, chairs scraping, someone crying, and a long, terrible silence where 30 people who might have done something instead did nothing at all. "Where is he?" The larger man was in front of her now. Up close, he had a tattoo on the side of his neck, a number, partially obscured by his collar. His voice was entirely conversational. "Trauma wing. Which bay?" Nora didn't answer. She was running a quiet parallel calculation. Strap tension, angle of pull, the position of the man behind her relative to the counter. Her vision had developed a slight haze at the edges, which told her the strap was doing what it was designed to do. "You're a nurse," the man said, almost like he found it amusing. "You're just a nurse. You think somebody's coming for you right now?" He looked around the frozen cafeteria. "Look at these people. Nobody's moving." She looked at the people. He was right, technically. Nobody was moving toward her. But she wasn't looking for rescuers. She was looking at the dietary workers still behind the serving counter, 3 of them, pressed against the back wall. She caught the eye of Marcus, the young one who had told her about the dark roast. He was frozen, but he was looking at her. She moved her left hand very slightly, fingers down, a slow patting gesture. Stay low, stay back. It was a battlefield hand signal, clear and instinctive, and Marcus, who had no idea what it meant formally, understood it the way humans generally understand the language of someone who is calm when they shouldn't be. He crouched. The other two followed. The man in front of her was still talking. Last time, trauma wing. Which bay? I don't have access to federal holds, Nora said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, which was partly training and partly the fact that she was very focused on something happening at the far end of the cafeteria near the exit. There was a man standing there. He hadn't been there before. She was certain of that. He was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, nothing distinctive, and he was holding something small and rectangular near his mouth. Not a phone. A radio. He was completely still, and he was looking directly at her with an expression that she couldn't interpret at distance except that it wasn't fear. The attacker grabbed her jaw and turned her face back toward him. Don't look at the door. She didn't resist the redirect. She filed the information instead. Tell me which bay, or I start working my way through your coworkers until someone tells me. The threat was effective, which he knew, because Nora stopped arguing. She said, Bay 4, which was true, and which told him exactly nothing he couldn't have gotten from the restricted notation visible to anyone in the system with basic access. What it bought her was 30 seconds, him relaying the information to someone on his own radio, a brief distraction, a slight loosening of the strap. She didn't use the 30 seconds to escape. She used them to look around the cafeteria again, slowly, like she was scared and disoriented, and to mark every person still in the room and identify which ones were mobile and which ones were not. An elderly man in the far corner who was having difficulty standing up, she logged him. A woman with a toddler near the serving line who had flattened herself under a table, logged. 3 nurses she recognized from the overnight shift clustered near the beverage station. She caught the eye of the one on the end, a senior RN named Gretchen, who she knew was steady, and did the hand signal again, slower this time. Down, stay down. Gretchen stared at her. Then Gretchen sat down on the floor without a word, and the other 2 followed. The large man noticed. What are you doing? I'm scared, Nora said. I'm trying to get people to sit down so they don't do anything stupid. He looked at the group near the beverage station, now seated on the floor with their backs against the wall, and apparently decided this was plausible. Smart. It wasn't fear management. It was a staging decision. She was clearing the floor, reducing obstacles, creating open lanes. If you had spent enough time in forward operating environments, you stopped thinking about rooms as rooms. You thought about them as problems with a geometry, and you started working the geometry. She couldn't do much with the strap around her throat. That was the honest calculation. She had one hand with partial mobility. The strap was cutting into the side of her neck every time the man behind her adjusted his grip. And the room was a public space full of civilians who would be in the crossfire of anything that escalated. She was not going to escalate. But the man by the exit was still there. He had moved 6 inches closer, barely perceptible, and when she looked at him again, he did something with his free hand, a signal she didn't recognize, directed not at her but at something above and to the left. She followed the angle and found the cafeteria's corner-mounted security camera, the one that covered the serving line and the main floor. The camera had a small indicator light on its housing. The light was on. Someone was watching. Outside the hospital, in a black SUV idling in the emergency bay, a man named Garrett Hale sat in the passenger seat with a radio in his hand and watched the cafeteria feed on a tablet mounted to the dashboard. He was 51 years old, built like someone who had spent decades making the kind of decisions that didn't leave paperwork, and he had been following the Valdez Network, the criminal organization whose soldiers were currently inside Harlan Vale Medical Center, for 11 months. The witness in Trauma Bay 4 was named Ramon Escobar. He had survived 2 attempts on his life in the past 3 weeks. His testimony was the hinge point of a federal case that had taken 4 years and 9 undercover operatives to construct. If he died in this hospital, the case died with him. Garrett had known this was a possibility. What he had not anticipated was the nurse. He was watching the cafeteria feed when one of his agents, a younger man named Trevino, the one he'd positioned at the cafeteria exit, sent him a short message. She's military. Watch her hands. Garrett had watched her hands. He had watched her clear the floor, position the civilians, manage her own airway pressure by keeping her chin angled. He had watched her give a hand signal he half recognized from joint operation training to a cafeteria worker who had no reason to understand it and had understood it anyway. "Who is she?" he said. His agent in the vehicle with him, a woman named Pacheco who handled the personnel side of things, was already typing. "Nora Voss, ER nurse, 4 years at Harlan Vale. Before that," a pause, the kind that meant she had found something. "Army. Forward surgical team, 2 deployments. She's got a commendation ribbon she's never filed for formal civilian recognition. The citation's sealed." "What's it for?" Pacheco was quiet for a moment. "Vehicle extraction under fire. She pulled 2 men out of a burning MRAP while the site was still taking small arms. One of the men survived." Garrett looked at the feed, at the woman in scrubs with a strap around her throat, who was very methodically managing a hostage situation from inside the hostage situation. "Get me Harlan Vale security override," he said, "and tell the team we're moving in 4 minutes. Well, back in the cafeteria, the situation had developed a new problem. The younger attacker, the one who had stayed near the exit, had moved to the serving line and found the oxygen supply junction that fed the dietary wing's medical-grade utility connection. Harlan Vale, like most large hospitals built in the 90s, had piped oxygen running through the walls to supplement portable units during mass casualty events. The cafeteria connection was supposed to be valve-locked, but the lock was a standard keyed valve that maintenance had last checked during an inspection 8 months ago. The man didn't know what he was doing exactly. He was looking for something he could use as leverage, a threat, a tool, something to accelerate the situation. What he found was a valve. He turned it. The line ruptured at the junction. The sound was a deep, pressured hiss, followed immediately by the kind of concentrated mist that came from a high-pressure gas expanding into room-temperature air. Within seconds, the serving line area was obscured. Within 30 seconds, the hiss had filled the near half of the cafeteria with a cold, dense vapor that caught the fluorescent light and made the room feel suddenly, disorientingly wrong. Someone screamed again. Then multiple people screamed. The herd instinct in a crowd under threat is not rational. It responds to stimulus and sensation, and the sensation of visibility dropping in an enclosed space while you are already terrified is exactly the kind of thing that turns a tense standoff into a stampede. Nora felt the man behind her flinch at the sound of the rupture. His grip on the strap shifted. It wasn't much, a 1/4 inch of slack, but it was enough. She dropped her weight fast, shooting her chin down and driving her elbow back simultaneously, a close quarter technique that was less about striking and more about breaking structure. The strap scraped her ear and the side of her face as it came off her throat. She was already moving, not away. Away was wrong. Away was open floor. Away was getting recaptured. But toward the counter, putting a physical barrier between herself and the man with the strap. Her hands hit the counter edge and she vaulted it. Not gracefully. She caught her hip on the corner and felt something that was going to be a serious bruise, and she went down on one knee on the other side of the counter, behind the serving line, and stayed low. The mist from the ruptured oxygen line was thicker here. She could hear the 2 men on the other side of the counter calling to each other in clipped, angry sentences. The oxygen itself wasn't dangerous at this concentration. It wouldn't combust unless someone introduced a spark. But it was cold and disorienting, and it had done what she needed it to do, which was create chaos that was harder for 2 people to manage than for 1. She moved down the length of the counter on her hands and knees. Marcus was in the corner, still down where she'd signaled him to stay. And when she reached him, she grabbed his arm. "Kitchen," she said very quietly. "Back exit. Go." "What about?" "Kitchen. Everyone behind the counter. Back exit. Now." He went. She heard the others follow. Then she turned around and looked back into the cafeteria, and for a moment she could see clearly through a gap in the mist. The elderly man in the far corner still hadn't moved. She stayed where she was for exactly 2 seconds, running the calculation. The 2 attackers were in the center of the room now, disoriented by the mist and the noise. She had roughly a 12-foot open stretch to cross to get to the corner, which was also visible from the center of the room. The man in the corner was using a walker, which explained why he hadn't evacuated with the initial panic. He was not going to make it to the kitchen exit under his own steam. She moved anyway. She came over the counter on the other side, staying low, using the mist as cover, and crossed the 12 feet in the kind of crouched run that made her look like she'd done it before. She reached the elderly man, small, white-haired, wearing a plaid shirt, and the expression of someone who had decided some time ago that the world was going to do what it was going to do. And she got her arm around his shoulders. "I'm going to help you up," she said, right into his ear. "We're going to walk to the kitchen exit. Don't talk, don't stop." "Okay," he said, like she'd offered to carry his tray. They were halfway across the cafeteria, not invisible at all, when the larger attacker came out of the mist and saw her. "Hey!" She didn't look back. She kept moving, one hand on the old man's arm, one hand on his walker, and she was 3 steps from the kitchen doors when she heard the sound that changed everything. It came from outside the building, a low, rhythmic percussion that built so fast it went from distant to overhead in under 10 seconds. Nora knew that sound. She had heard it in 2 different countries and once in a dream that woke her up at 3 in the morning. It was rotor blades. More than one aircraft, low and fast and not there by accident, and then every light in the cafeteria went out. Not a flicker, a clean, total cut. Emergency power brought the exits back online in red within 3 seconds. But for those 3 seconds, the room was completely dark, and the 2 men in the center of it had no way to see where anyone was. She got the old man through the kitchen door. The kitchen staff had already gone. The back exit was standing open. She could hear radios outside, not the handheld crackle of hospital security, but the precise, clipped communication of people running a coordinated entry. She guided the man out the back exit, handed him to a woman in a dark jacket who materialized from somewhere to her left and who said, "We've got him, ma'am. Step back," with the particular authority that comes from this being something you do regularly. Nora stepped back. She stood outside in the service alley behind the cafeteria, breathing, and watched 4 tactical operators in full kit move past her toward the kitchen entrance with the smooth, specific economy of people who had done exactly this many times before. One of them stopped, looked at her scrubs, her face, the strap burn on her neck that she'd been ignoring. "You the nurse?" he said. "Yes." "Hale wants to know if anyone's still in there." She thought about the geometry of the room, the 2 attackers, last position, the civilians she'd cleared, the gap in her information. "I don't know. I cleared the serving line side and the far corner. The center was misted. 2 subjects, adult males, both armed." He nodded like she'd given him a standard tactical brief, which she more or less had, and moved past her into the kitchen. Inside the hospital, something heavy hit the floor. There was a short burst of radio communication she couldn't parse, then silence, then more radio. Then, from somewhere on the 2nd floor, she heard someone give a single sharp verbal command, and then nothing. It lasted less than 2 minutes. She stood in the alley, hand pressed flat against the building wall, because her legs had started doing the thing they did sometimes after, not shaking exactly, more like a quiet vibration in the muscle, the body's way of acknowledging after the fact what the mind had been too busy to process. She had managed that. She was okay. The old man was okay. She thought Phyllis was okay. She thought Gretchen was okay. She didn't know about the patient in Trauma Bay 4. A door opened at the end of the alley. The man she had seen inside the cafeteria, civilian clothes, the radio, completely still, came through it and walked toward her. He was taller than he'd seemed at distance, and he moved the way the operators had moved, not identically but from the same source material. He stopped about 6 feet away and looked at her for a moment without saying anything. "You're Hale," she said. "Garrett Hale." He didn't offer a hand. "You kept them in the cafeteria." "I kept them busy." "You cleared 23 people from an active hostage situation without starting a panic." "I started a little panic," Nora said. "The oxygen line helped." Something shifted briefly in his expression, not quite amusement. "That wasn't planned." "I know. I worked with what was there." He looked at the strap burn on her neck. She had a feeling he was the kind of person who cataloged information the way she did, quietly, continuously, without making a production of it. "We need your statement," he said, "and I need to know if you recognize either of the individuals from the cafeteria." "No, I don't know them." "You sure?" "I would remember." He nodded slowly. Started to say something, then stopped. Looked at her again with the expression of someone recalibrating. "Your service record," he said. "The citation's sealed." Nora felt something cool move through her. "Yes." "Do you know why I'd have access to it?" She hadn't thought about this. She thought about it now, standing in the service alley with hospital noise beginning to filter back to her. Sirens, voices, the particular organized chaos of a facility reestablishing function after a crisis. She thought about what level of federal authorization you'd need to access a sealed military commendation and what kind of operation would bring that level of authorization to a hospital in Caldwell City. "Escobar," she said. Hale didn't confirm or deny it. "You should get that neck looked at," he said, "and then someone is going to need to talk to you." He said it like a warning and an apology at the same time. "This isn't over." He walked back toward the door he'd come from, and Nora stood in the alley and looked at the sky above the service entrance, which was gray and flat and entirely ordinary, and heard in the near distance the sound of 2 helicopters beginning their descent toward the hospital roof. The witness was still upstairs, and whoever had sent 2 armed men into a hospital cafeteria to find him had just lost those 2 men, which meant they knew this location was compromised, which meant the next move would be faster and worse, and Nora understood, with the particular clarity that comes from having been in situations where the sequence of events is predetermined and the only variable is how much damage you can limit, that her morning was nowhere close to finished. She pushed off the wall and went back inside. She went back in through the kitchen, past the stainless steel prep tables and the industrial dishwasher still cycling through a load nobody had stopped, and she walked out into the main corridor of Harlan Vale like she was returning from a break, which technically she was. The hospital had activated its internal emergency protocol, Code Gray, which covered situations involving combative or threatening individuals. And the overhead PA was cycling through the standard calm voice announcement that asked non-essential personnel to shelter in place and await further instruction. The hallways had that particular texture that came after sudden violence. Too quiet in some places, too loud in others, the normal rhythms broken and not yet reestablished. A dietary worker Nora didn't recognize was sitting on the floor against the wall outside the cafeteria service entrance with her knees pulled up to her chest, and a hospital security officer was crouching next to her with his hand on her shoulder, saying something low and steady. He looked up when Nora walked by. His face said he had questions. She kept moving. The ER was 3 corridors and an elevator away. She covered the distance in just under 2 minutes, checking corners out of a habit she had never managed to unlearn. And when she pushed through the ER doors, she found the department in a state of controlled high-tension function. The charge desk was staffed by 2 people instead of 1. Every bay had its curtain drawn. The attending physician on duty, a compact, fast-moving woman named Dr. Reyes, who had been at Harlan Vale for 12 years and who Nora had a complicated professional respect for, was at the central station talking to someone on the phone with the kind of clipped, careful language that meant she was talking to administration. Nora went to the medication room first, found the supplies she needed, and used a hand mirror to look at her neck. The strap burn was red and linear, about 2 inches below her right ear, already starting to develop the tight, angry look of a contusion. It was going to be spectacular by tomorrow. She cleaned it, applied a dressing, and went back out to the floor. Gretchen was at the nurse's station. She looked up when Nora appeared, and something complicated moved across her face. Relief, mostly, with a layer of something that wasn't quite anger, but was in that neighborhood. "I was told you were in the alley," she said. "I was. I came back." "You should be giving a statement somewhere." "I will. What's the status on Trauma Bay 4? Gretchen hesitated. "Federal people are up there. They moved the patient about 20 minutes ago. I don't know where." "Good," Nora thought. She didn't say it out loud. "Anything I need to know about down here?" "Besides the fact that 2 armed men just assaulted hospital staff and held 30 people hostage in our cafeteria? Besides that." Gretchen looked at her for a long moment. She was 53, had worked trauma nursing longer than Nora had been alive, and was one of the few people in the department who had never tried to manage Nora or smooth her out or explain to her that things worked better when you didn't push. Bay 2 needs a dressing change, she finally said. And the construction worker from this morning is asking if he can have his phone back. Nora nodded and picked up a chart. She worked for the next 40 minutes the way she always worked. Steadily, accurately, without performance. The dressing change in Bay 2 went fine. The construction worker, a man named Dove, who had a nail through the meat of his left palm and was taking it with considerable dignity, got his phone back and immediately called his wife. Nora listened to half of that conversation involuntarily and thought that Dove's wife was going to need a minute to compose herself. She restocked the supply cart in Bay 5, caught a medication calculation error on an intake form before it went to pharmacy, and charted 2 assessments she had been behind on since early morning. The work helped. It always helped. There was something about the specificity of it, this person, this wound, this number, this time, that occupied the part of her brain that otherwise had a tendency to run problem-solving loops she couldn't shut off. She was in the middle of the Bay 5 restock when the door to the ER opened and Garrett Hale walked in with a woman she hadn't seen before. The woman was around 40, dark hair pulled back, wearing a jacket that matched Hale's in the way that government-issue clothing tended to match without being identical. She moved differently than Hale, less like a field person, more like someone who spent her time in rooms where decisions were made rather than rooms where they were carried out. She was carrying a thin folder. Hale found Nora by looking at the wrong bay first, then the right one. He didn't look surprised that she was working. "Miss Voss, this is Agent Pacheco. She needs a few minutes." "I'm in the middle of something." "It'll keep," Pacheco said. Not unkindly. She said it the way people said it when they already knew what you were doing and had made the calculation that it was lower priority than what they needed. "Is there somewhere we can sit?" There was a small consultation room off the main corridor that was used for family notifications and occasionally for residents who needed to collect themselves after a bad outcome. Nora put down the supply cart and led them there. The room had 3 chairs, a box of tissues on a side table, and a painting of a lake that was doing its best. She sat. Pacheco sat across from her and opened the folder. Hale stayed near the door with his arms crossed, which appeared to be his default position. "I want to be straightforward with you," Pacheco said. "What happened this morning is part of a federal investigation that has been active for over a year. The 2 individuals taken into custody in the cafeteria are affiliated with an organized crime network called the Valdez Operation. We've been tracking their leadership for 11 months. The witness you were protecting, without knowing you were protecting him, is the centerpiece of our case." Nora waited. "You kept those men occupied for approximately 19 minutes. In that time, we were able to complete the relocation of the witness to a secondary secure location. If you hadn't—" Pacheco paused, chose her words. "If the situation in the cafeteria had resolved differently, they might have gotten to Trauma Bay 4 before our team was in position." "I wasn't trying to protect him," Nora said. "I didn't know who was in Bay 4. I was trying to keep my coworkers from getting hurt." "I know," Pacheco said. "That's what I'm telling you." There was a silence. Hale shifted slightly near the door. "Is there something you need from me?" Nora said. Pacheco looked at the folder. "There are some things you need to know, and then there are some things I want to ask you." She said the second part more carefully than the first. "The Valdez network knew the witness was here. That information is restricted to a very small group of people: federal handlers, hospital administration, and 2 senior members of the medical staff. The 2 men in your cafeteria didn't find this hospital by accident." Nora felt the temperature of the room change slightly, the way rooms did when the conversation shifted from explanation to implication. "You think there's someone inside the hospital?" "We think it's possible. And until we determine whether that's the case, the situation here is still active." Pacheco closed the folder. "I want to ask you about the hospital's administrative structure, specifically about who would have had access to the witness's intake records." "I'm a floor nurse," Nora said. "I don't have visibility into administration." "But you've worked here 4 years. You know who talks to whom. You know the informal structure." Pacheco's voice was level, without pressure. "We're not asking you to do anything. We're asking you to think. Nora thought. She thought about who at Harlan Vale had the kind of access that a federal case notification would require. The hospital administrator, a man named Breck Tolliver, who had been in the position for 3 years and who Nora had a specific and documented opinion of, the chief medical officer, the security director, the nursing supervisor for the trauma unit, and possibly the charge desk, depending on how the system access had been configured. She thought about Dillard, the charge nurse whose medication log complaint had gone nowhere. She thought about whether that was relevant or whether she was letting her own resentment do the analysis for her. She set it aside. Tolliver has full system access, she said. Anyone in his office does. I don't know the security configurations for the federal hold notation, but it would flow through administration. She paused. I'm not accusing anyone. I genuinely don't know. That's fine, Pacheco said. That's helpful. She stood, and Hale straightened near the door. One more thing. For the moment, we're asking that you don't discuss this morning's events in detail with your colleagues. Not because we think you're a risk, but because if there is someone in this building passing information, we don't want them to know what we know. Nora nodded. That was standard enough. Also, Hale said from the door, and his voice had something different in it than it had in the alley. Not quite careful, but more considered. You should know that your service record came up in our briefing this morning before the situation in the cafeteria. You were flagged as a known quantity. She looked at him. Why was I flagged at all? Because of who you treated, he said, 7 years ago. Overseas. The room was quiet. Nora knew exactly what he meant. She had treated a lot of people in a lot of conditions over 6 years of service, and most of them had blurred together the way they did when the volume was high enough. But there were specific ones that hadn't blurred. The MRAP vehicle. The burning. The 2 men she had reached through the door before the secondary fire caught. One of those men had not survived. The other one had. She had never known his name. He had been unconscious and critical, and she had been in the middle of a different emergency by the time he was stabilized enough to be evacuated. She had asked later and been told that he had been transported for further care, and that she didn't need to know anything else, which was the kind of answer the Army gave you when it had made a decision about what you needed to know. I don't know who I treated, she said. I was told not to know. Hale nodded. He asked to be here, he said. The man running this operation. It's his case. He requested Caldwell City specifically, and he requested Harlan Vale specifically when we were choosing locations for the witness. He didn't tell me why at first. He looked at her steadily. He told me this morning. Something in Nora's chest did a complicated thing that she didn't have a word for. She didn't ask the next question. She could see that Hale wasn't going to answer it right now. Not in this room, not with this much still unresolved. He was telling her enough to keep her from being blindsided, not enough to distract her, which was a tactical decision, and she recognized it as one, and she found she didn't entirely resent it. Get some food, Pacheco said at the door. Not the cafeteria. They left. Nora sat in the consultation room for a moment with the box of tissues and the lake painting and the particular quiet that followed a conversation that had asked more questions than it answered. Then she got up, went back to the floor, and picked up the supply cart where she'd left it. The day continued. She changed a dressing in Bay 2 that she had already changed once, because the patient had pulled at it in the interval. She talked a frightened teenage girl through a procedure that the girl's mother, sitting in the chair by the bed, was too scared to explain calmly. She ate a bag of crackers from the nurse's station supply drawer at 1:30 because the cafeteria was still cordoned off, and she hadn't managed to get to the vending machines. The crackers were the kind with cheese powder that turned her fingers orange, and she ate them methodically over a chart. At 2:15, Gretchen appeared at her shoulder with the particular energy of someone who has been sitting on something for a while. There's something going on with the administrative wing, she said quietly, angling away from the closest occupied bay. Tolliver's office has had federal people in it for the past hour. Nora kept her face neutral. Code Gray generates a lot of paperwork. This is different. His assistant was crying in the third-floor bathroom. Lena from billing told me. Nora thought about Pacheco's folder, about access records and intake notations, and the specific small group of people who would have known about a federal witness in Trauma Bay 4. "People get stressed," she said. "Today was a lot." Gretchen looked at her. Gretchen was not, by any standard, an easily managed person. "You know something," she said. "I know what I told the federal agents in the consultation room, and I know what I've seen on this floor today, and I know that I was asked not to speculate out loud." Nora held her gaze. "I'm asking you to let it go for tonight." A long pause. Gretchen had the expression of someone swallowing something that tasted bad. "Fine," she said finally. "But you're telling me eventually." "If I can." Gretchen walked away, and Nora turned back to the chart, and the afternoon continued to unspool in the way afternoons did in an emergency department. Not steadily, but in the rhythm of arrivals and departures, and small emergencies and larger ones, and the constant low hum of people who needed something and the effort of providing it. She was finishing her end-of-shift documentation at 6:45 when her pager went off. Not the department pager. Her personal pager, the small secondary device she carried because the hospital system had dead spots on the second floor, and she'd learned years ago that you needed a backup. The number on it was a 4-digit extension she didn't recognize. She called it from the corridor phone. It rang twice, and then a man's voice said her name. Just her name. Nora Voss. Not a question. She didn't recognize the voice, but there was something about the quality of it that made her go still in the way she had gone still in the cafeteria. Not frightened exactly, but fully present. "Yes," she said. "I need you to come to the 3rd floor," the voice said. "Administration wing, conference room 3C. A pause. "I should have introduced myself a long time ago. I understand if you need a minute to think about whether you're coming." Another pause. "I'm the other one. From the vehicle." The corridor was quiet around her. Down the hall, someone wheeled a cart around a corner, and the wheels squeaked against the tile and then faded. The fluorescent light above her had a barely perceptible flicker that she had reported twice to facilities and that had not been fixed. She looked at the phone in her hand and then at the ceiling and then at nothing in particular. "I don't need a minute," she said, and hung up. She took the stairs. The stairwell was institutional and cold, the way hospital stairwells always were. Painted cinder block, rubber-edged steps, a faint chemical smell that clung to the air even when nothing had been cleaned recently. Nora took them 2 at a time, not running but close to it, and she told herself on the way up that she was not nervous, which was partially true. The 3rd floor administrative wing was a different world from the floors below it. Quieter. Carpeted. The overhead lighting was warmer, the kind of deliberate choice that signaled money and the desire to be taken seriously. She passed 3 closed office doors and a reception desk that was unmanned at this hour, and at the end of the corridor she found 3C, a conference room with frosted glass panels on either side of the door and light coming through from inside. She didn't knock. She opened the door and went in. The room had a long oval table, 8 chairs, and a whiteboard on the far wall that someone had recently wiped but not entirely cleaned, ghost marks of previous diagrams still visible in the surface. Garrett Hale was standing near the window with his back to her. Agent Pacheco was at the table with a laptop open and her jacket off. And at the head of the table, standing up when the door opened, was a man Nora had never seen before. He was in his mid-40s, probably, lean in the way that came from structure rather than metabolism, with a face that had the kind of weathering that happened at altitude and in heat and in conditions that didn't offer a lot of recovery time. He was wearing civilian clothes, dark slacks, a collared shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and his left forearm had a scar that ran from the wrist halfway to the elbow that Nora clocked before she looked at his face. She had pulled people out of burning vehicles. She knew what fire did to skin. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice was the one from the phone. "I'm Declan Ward. I run the Valdez Task Force out of the Federal Field Office in Marin City." He paused. "And 7 years ago, I was in the passenger seat of a MRAP that took an IED strike on a road outside a town I can't name in a country I won't." Nora stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she came in and let the door close behind her. "I was told the passenger didn't make it," she said. "The passenger didn't. I was in the seat behind him." Ward's expression didn't change, but something around the eyes shifted, a compression, brief and controlled. I was critical for about 4 hours. You kept me critical instead of gone. He said it with the flatness of someone who had rehearsed this many times and still didn't have a version they were comfortable with. I've been trying to find the right way to tell you that for a long time. You didn't have to, Nora said. I know I didn't. He looked at her steadily. That's not the only reason I'm telling you. She pulled out a chair and sat down, because standing seemed wrong suddenly. Not weak, just inefficient. What's the other reason? He sat too. Pacheco closed the laptop partway and was quiet. Hale turned from the window but didn't come closer. Whatever was about to be said, Nora understood that everyone in the room already knew it except her. The Valdez network has 3 people in its upper structure, Ward said. We have cases on 2 of them. The third one, the one who runs their money, their placement, their infiltration operations, we haven't been able to identify. We've been calling him the architect. No photograph, no financial trail that stays consistent, no confirmed name. He spread his hands flat on the table. What we do have, as of 3 hours ago, is a data pull from Breck Tolliver's administrative records. Tolliver gave up the witness, Nora said. It wasn't a question. Tolliver received a wire transfer 8 days ago through 3 shell accounts to a private investment vehicle he's been running for 6 years. The transfer originated from a holding company that we've linked to Valdez financial infrastructure. Ward paused. He also pulled the witness's intake records twice in the past 4 days using an administrative override that doesn't require secondary authorization. He didn't access the file through normal channels. He went around the system. Is he in custody? He's been detained for questioning. He's not talking yet. Ward's voice was precise and entirely without satisfaction. The problem isn't Tolliver. Tolliver is a transaction. Someone authorized the transaction, and that person knew we had Escobar here before Tolliver made the call. The placement at Harlan Vale was a federal decision. It didn't touch hospital administration until the morning of the transfer. Nora absorbed this. So, someone on your side told someone on their side before Tolliver was ever contacted. That's what it looks like. Which means the architect has access to your operation. Yes, Ward said, which is why I need to ask you something that I have no right to ask, and I want to be clear about that before I ask it. Nora waited. Ramon Escobar is stable. He's been moved to a secure location outside this facility. His testimony is intact. The case against 2/3 of the Valdez leadership can proceed with what we have. He looked at her directly. But if the architect stays unidentified, we'll be doing this again. Different city, different hospital, different witness. They'll build the network back inside of 2 years. He paused. We have a window right now. Tolliver's detention is going to be noticed. When the architect finds out the 2 men from the cafeteria are in federal custody, they're going to start burning things, accounts, contacts, records. We have maybe 48 hours before the trail goes cold. What does this have to do with me? Nora said. There's a secondary file, Pacheco said from the side of the table. She opened the laptop fully. Pulled from the hospital's internal system in the 40 minutes before our team executed the cafeteria entry this morning. Someone accessed the security camera grid, the trauma wing access logs, and the staff scheduling database. They were looking for something specific. She turned the laptop so Nora could see the screen. The access point was a terminal in the 3rd floor supply corridor. The badge used belonged to a staff member who was off duty and not in the building. Nora looked at the screen. A series of access log timestamps, a floor plan with a highlighted path, and a staff photo at the top of the record. The photo was a woman she didn't recognize. That badge was used, Pacheco continued, but the person who physically accessed the terminal was in the building. They had to be. The terminal requires in-person login. She paused. We pulled corridor footage. The person at the terminal kept their back to the camera. They knew where it was. Someone who works here, Nora said. Someone who works here knows the camera placements and had access to a staff badge that wasn't theirs. Pacheco closed the laptop. We've narrowed it to the 3rd floor, administrative wing, and the department adjacent to it, which is medical records, Nora said. Yes. She sat with this. Medical records on the 3rd floor shared a corridor with administrative services. A space she walked through maybe once a week when she needed to pull a historical file that hadn't been digitized. She thought about the people she had seen in that corridor over 4 years, the faces she knew by context rather than by name, the people who knew where the cameras were because they had been here long enough that the building's geography was embedded. "I can't identify this person for you," she said. "I don't know medical records well enough." "We're not asking you to identify anyone," Ward said. "We're asking you to do something different." He leaned forward slightly. "We want to run a controlled information release, a false record planted in the system, indicating that Escobar has been returned to Harlan Vale and is now in a secured bay on the 4th floor. If the architect's contact inside this building accesses that record and passes it up the chain, we'll know two things: who the inside contact is and how quickly the information reaches the top. You want to use the hospital as bait. We want to use the record as bait. The hospital just happens to be where the record lives." Nora looked at the whiteboard with its ghost diagrams. She thought about the construction of what he was proposing, the logic of it, the exposure, the things that could go wrong. If someone up the chain acts on that record before you identify the contact, you've got another armed response coming to this building. "Yes," Ward said, "that's the risk. You're asking me because you need someone on the floor who knows what an actual armed response looks like and won't freeze." "I'm asking you," Ward said, "because you're the only person in this building I know for certain isn't compromised, and because you've already demonstrated today that you can manage a situation faster than my people can reach it." It wasn't flattery. It was an assessment, delivered in the same tone he might use to describe a piece of equipment. She appreciated that. "What happens to my staff?" she said. "We'll have a team staged on every floor within 4 hours of releasing the false record. Nobody in this building will be in a position where my people can't reach them in under 60 seconds. That's not the same as nobody getting hurt." "No," he said, "it's not." She looked at Hale, who had been quiet through all of this, still near the window, arms still crossed. He met her gaze and said nothing, which she found more honest than anything else anyone could have offered. "I need to think," she said. "Take the night," Ward said. "I need an answer by 6 tomorrow morning." She stood up. "If I say yes, I'm not staying in the background." "I know. I mean specifically. If something comes through this building, I'm not hiding in a supply room." Ward looked at her for a moment. "I'll have Pacheco brief you on the tactical parameters." He said it like he'd already made that decision before she walked into the room, which he probably had. "One more thing." He hesitated, and it was the first hesitation she had seen from him that looked unscripted. "I looked at your commendation, the full citation." He paused again. "You went back in. After you pulled us out. You went back into the vehicle because you thought there was a third person." She hadn't thought about that part in a long time. There wasn't, but you didn't know that." She picked up the chair she'd been sitting in and pushed it back under the table, a useless procedural gesture, something to do with her hands. "I did my job," she said. "That's all." She left the conference room and went down the stairs and back to the ER and finished her documentation and clocked out at 7:40, which was almost an hour late. The night air outside the hospital was warm and still carried the faint industrial smell that the freight yards laid over the whole east side of Caldwell City at this hour. She sat in her car in the parking structure for a few minutes without starting it, thinking through the geometry of what Ward had proposed. The bait was clean. The logic was clean. The risk was the gap between when the information moved and when it could be contained, and that gap was real, and the people who would be in it were people she had worked beside for 4 years. Gretchen, Marcus, Phyllis, Dove in Bay 1, who was probably still there, since nail extractions sometimes caught complications. The overnight staff she knew by name and face who were walking into the building right now as she sat here. She started the car and drove home. She lived 20 minutes from the hospital in an apartment that was clean without being comfortable. Functional furniture, good kitchen knives, a collection of medical reference texts on the shelf next to a set of weights she actually used. She had no plants because she had killed every plant she had ever owned, a fact she had come to accept as a personality trait rather than a failure. She made rice and eggs at 8:15 and ate at the kitchen counter, not because she was hungry, but because she needed the routine. She was in bed by 9:30. She did not sleep well. At 5:50 in the morning, she texted Ward's number. Pacheco had put it in her phone before she left the conference room. A single word. Yes. By 6:15, she was in the parking structure, and by 6:30, she was back in the building, and by 6:45, the false record was live in Harlan Vale's internal system, indicating that patient Escobar, Ramon, federal hold, restricted access, had been returned to care and was currently in secured Bay 2 on the 4th floor. The 4th floor was pediatrics. Ward had chosen it deliberately. Any incoming threat would be heading to the wrong department entirely, buying time and creating confusion. Pacheco had walked her through it the night before by phone, the staged positions, the communications protocol, the signals she was to use if she saw something before the team did. Simple. Practical. The kind of plan that worked when the execution was clean and fell apart when it wasn't. Nora clocked in, put her bag in her locker, and went to work. The morning was a Thursday, which at Harlan Vale meant a slightly heavier volume than Wednesday, some pattern in the week's rhythm she had never fully explained to herself. She had 3 patients by 7:30, 4 by 8, and was on her second chart when Gretchen came up beside her with the careful, angled approach of someone who had something to say and had been thinking about how to say it. "Tolliver's been formally suspended," Gretchen said. Quiet. Facing the workstation so that she appeared to be looking at the screen rather than talking. "There's a notice from the board. Interim administration is being handled by the CMO. "When did that go out?" 20 minutes ago. Building-wide email. Gretchen paused. "People are talking. Let them." "Nora." The name came out with a specific weight. "Are we safe?" She thought about Ward's 60-second guarantee. "There are federal agents in this building," she said. "I don't know the full picture. I need you to trust that." Gretchen was quiet for a moment. "You're going to owe me a very long conversation." "I know." The morning moved. She kept track of 2 things simultaneously. The way she had learned to do in environments where the clinical and the tactical existed in the same space, the work directly in front of her, and everything in her peripheral field. Ward's team was good. She spotted one of them, a young man in maintenance coveralls near the elevator bank at 9, because she was looking for them. If she hadn't been looking, she would have missed him entirely. At 9:40, the hospital's internal system logged an access event. She knew this because Ward texted her 3 letters. Hit. Her pulse moved up a few beats. She finished the medication she was drawing up, labeled it correctly, administered it to the patient in Bay 3, documented it, and then went to the supply alcove off the main corridor and stood with her back against the shelving, in the particular not quite stillness of someone who is waiting. Her phone buzzed. Ward, Medical Records Terminal, 3rd floor. Same access corridor as yesterday. So not a remote access. Someone was physically in the building, on the 3rd floor right now, using a terminal in the same corridor they had used yesterday. Which meant they were either very confident or very stupid, and in Nora's experience, those 2 things occasionally overlapped. She texted back, "Who?" A longer pause this time, then, "Working on it. Stay on floor." She stayed on the floor. She went back to Bay 3, checked on her patient, moved to Bay 5. She kept moving. Movement was better than stillness in an active situation. Stillness made you a fixed point, and fixed points got targeted. Movement made you part of the background. At 10:07, the overhead PA came on. It wasn't the code gray announcement. It was the general intercom, and the voice was a woman's, flat, rapid, reading from something rather than speaking naturally. "Attention, this is a notification from hospital security. We are conducting a routine access audit on the 3rd and 4th floors. Non-essential personnel, please remain at your current workstations. This will take approximately..." The PA cut out. Not a normal cut. Not the standard end-of-announcement silence. A cut, clean and mid-sentence, like someone had physically ended the transmission. Nora was already moving toward the corridor. Her phone went off twice in rapid succession. "Ward, go to stairwell B, 3rd floor. Do not use elevator." Then, 5 seconds later, "We have a problem." She took stairwell B at a run. The 3rd floor corridor was wrong from the moment she pushed through the stairwell door. Not in an obvious way, not yet, but in the specific way she had learned to read, the texture of a space that should have 3 or 4 people in it and had none. The fluorescents were on. The carpet was quiet. The doors were closed. She moved to the supply corridor, the access corridor, the one with the terminal, and found it empty. The terminal screen was on and logged out. The session just ended, the cursor blinking in the login field. Someone had been here maybe 90 seconds ago. She heard Ward's voice in the stairwell behind her. Not her stairwell, the other one. And then the particular sound of a door being pushed hard and fast. And she turned and saw Pacheco coming through at a controlled run with two other agents, and they all moved past her without stopping, which told her the direction she should not go. She went the other way. The third-floor corridor bent left past the administrative offices and opened into a small reception area that connected to the elevator lobby and the door to the medical records department. The reception area was empty. The door to medical records was slightly open. Not fully, not in the way it would be if someone had come through in a hurry, but in the slow swinging way of a door not quite caught in its frame. She pushed it open. The medical records department was a long, narrow room with server racks along one wall and rows of indexed filing shelves along the other, a holdover from the years before full digitization that nobody had cleared out. At the far end was a second exit door that led to an exterior stairwell. That door was open too, and the afternoon light was coming through it, and between Nora and that light was a woman. She was in her early 50s maybe, with short dark hair and the particular look of someone who had spent decades being professionally invisible. Not remarkable in any direction, the kind of person you had seen 100 times without registering. She was wearing a Harlan Vale staff badge. She was holding a laptop in one hand and moving toward the exterior exit, and she was almost there. "Stop," Nora said. The woman stopped. She turned around and her face was entirely still, which was the most frightening kind of face in a situation like this. Not panicked, not caught, just recalculating. She looked at Nora in scrubs with the strap burn still visible on her neck, and something moved in her expression, recognition, and then the specific terrible reassessment of someone who has just realized they miscalculated something important. "You're the nurse," the woman said. "I am," Nora said. "You should go back downstairs." "I'm not going to do that." The woman looked at the exterior exit. 3 steps away, door already open, and then back at Nora. The calculation was visible. Nora was between her and the interior corridor, but the exterior exit was closer. It led to a stairwell, and from a stairwell you could go up or down. And if you went up, you reached the roof access, and there was a reason the helicopter landing pad on this hospital's roof had been relevant to events 24 hours ago. "Whatever they told you about me," the woman said, "is partial." "I'm sure," Nora said. "That's how it usually works." The woman moved. She went for the exterior exit fast, the laptop clutched against her chest, and she was through the door and onto the exterior landing before Nora had fully closed the distance. Nora followed her through, into the light, onto the metal landing of the exterior fire stair, and the woman was already 4 steps down and moving fast. The staircase was old, wrought iron, bolted to the building's exterior, the kind installed in the 70s that shuddered slightly with the weight of someone moving quickly on it. Nora took the steps in threes and caught the woman's arm at the landing between the second and third floor. The woman spun and drove an elbow into Nora's collarbone. It connected hard enough that Nora's grip broke and she hit the railing, and the railing gave a deep metallic complaint and she felt it flex under her weight before it held. The woman looked at her from 4 steps below. "You're not a security officer," she said, like this was clarifying something. "No," Nora agreed. Her collarbone was sending a sharp, specific signal she categorized and set aside. "Then you should stop." "No," she said again. The woman turned and ran down the last flight. She hit the ground-level exit door at speed, and it opened outward, and she went through, and Nora was 8 steps behind her when the door came back and she caught it with her forearm and pushed through into the alley behind the administrative wing, which was not empty. Ward was there, and Pacheco, and 2 agents she hadn't seen before, and a Caldwell City police unit that had arrived sometime in the past 10 minutes, its lights going. The woman stopped in the middle of the alley. She looked at the people in front of her. She looked back at Nora, who had come through the door. She looked down at the laptop in her hand. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the woman, very carefully, very deliberately, set the laptop down on the ground. She straightened up. She put her hands out to her sides. "I want a lawyer," she said. "And I want federal counsel, not local." Pacheco moved forward. Ward stood where he was and looked at Nora, at the collarbone she was holding her right arm against, at the scrubs, at the general state of her, and said very quietly, "You were supposed to stay on your floor." "You said stay on my floor," Nora said. "You didn't say stay out of medical records." He looked at her for another moment. "That's a distinction I'd argue with you about later." "I'll be in the ER," she said. "Come find me when you're done." She turned and went back through the door, back up the stairs, because the elevator was going to take too long and she had patients waiting, and behind her she heard the specific sounds of an arrest being processed. Commands, acknowledgments, the mechanical click of restraints, and she kept climbing. She was back on the ER floor by 10:23. She went directly to the workstation, pulled up her charts, and continued where she had left off. Gretchen looked at her from across the nurses' station with an expression that had evolved well past the ability to be described in simple terms, and Nora said, "Later," and Gretchen said nothing, which was the right answer. At 11:15, Ward appeared at the ER entrance with Pacheco beside him. They stood there for a moment, which was when Nora realized from their expressions that whatever had been on that laptop had told them something, and that the something was not good. Ward caught her eye across the department. He said nothing. He just held up 3 fingers. 3. It took her a second to parse it, and when she did, her stomach dropped. 3 people. Not 2. Not Tolliver and the woman from medical records. 3 people inside Harlan Vale had been feeding information to the Valdez network, and whatever was on that laptop had just told them who the third one was. She looked across the ER, at the bays, the curtains, the workstations, the people moving between them, and understood that somewhere in this department, right now, was a person who had known about Ramon Escobar and had helped put everyone in this building in the path of armed men, and that person was still at work, and they didn't know yet that the laptop had been taken. 3 fingers. Nora stood at the workstation and kept her face neutral, which took effort because the math was doing something ugly in her head. Tolliver in administration. The woman from medical records, whose name she still didn't know, had not been told, a deliberate operational gap, and a third person. Someone in this building who was still undetected, still moving, still functional, still at their workstation, or walking the corridors or standing 6 feet from her right, now not knowing that a laptop had just been recovered in an alley behind the administrative wing. She looked at Ward across the department. He held her gaze long enough to communicate something specific, which was, "Stay calm, stay in place, do not change your behavior." She gave him a small nod and turned back to her chart. The next 20 minutes were the hardest kind of waiting, the kind where you had to perform normalcy while your threat assessment was running full speed underneath. She checked medication charts. She answered a call light in Bay 6. She talked a post-procedure patient through discharge instructions with complete attention, because that patient needed complete attention, and the fact that there was a federal operation unwinding around her was not the patient's problem. Pacheco appeared at the ER entrance at 11:40 and exchanged a word with the charge desk that Nora couldn't hear. Then Pacheco looked across the department floor directly at Dillard. Dillard, the charge nurse. CrossFit arms, short sleeves, the medication log that Nora had reported and nobody had acted on. He was at the central station with his back to Pacheco, entering something in the system, and he didn't look up. Nora felt the bottom drop out of the morning. She had set him aside. She had consciously, deliberately set aside her resentment of him because she didn't want her own history with him doing the analysis. She had been careful about that. And she had been wrong to be careful. Or rather, she had been careful in exactly the wrong direction. The caution she applied to avoid bias had resulted in a blind spot, which was a different kind of failure, but a failure nonetheless. Pacheco walked across the ER floor with the particular purposefulness that drew eyes, and Dillard looked up when she was about 8 feet away, and his face did something Nora had never seen it do before. Not guilt. She wasn't close enough to read that fine a detail, but a kind of settling, like a structure that had been under load for a long time and had finally been given permission to stop holding. "Mr. Dillard," Pacheco said, "could you come with me, please?" "I'm in the middle of, now," Pacheco said, Not loud, not aggressive. The specific authority of someone who isn't asking. Dillard set down the chart he was holding. He looked around the department, at Gretchen, who was watching from the medication room doorway, at two nurses at the far station who had gone still, at Nora, directly, across the span of the central floor. His expression when he found her face was unreadable. She held his gaze and gave him nothing, because she didn't have anything to give. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even the cold justification she might have expected to feel. He walked out with Pacheco. The ER went very quiet for about 15 seconds. Then it rebuilt itself, the way departments did, because patients didn't stop needing things because the drama had shifted, and the people who worked there had a professional immune response to disruption that was one of the better things about them. Gretchen walked up beside Nora and stood there for a moment. "Dillard," she said, flat, not a question. "Apparently." "How long?" "I don't know." Nora picked up a chart. "I really don't know." "The medication log," Gretchen said. "The one you reported. If he was compromised—" She stopped. "He would have had access to everything, patient assignments, security holds, shift schedules." "Yes." Gretchen was quiet. She was doing what Nora had done, running it back through 4 years of proximity, every decision Dillard had made or influenced, every complaint that had gone nowhere, every access event that had looked routine from the outside. It was the particular vertigo of realizing that the structure you had been standing in had a flaw you didn't know about, and now the flaw was visible, and you had to figure out what it changed about everything you thought you knew. "The complaint I filed," Nora said, "it wasn't just about the log." "I know," Gretchen said. "There were 3 other nurses who backed off before they put anything in writing. I don't know why. Maybe he pressured them. Maybe it wasn't worth it. I filed anyway and it went nowhere, and I assumed that was because nobody wanted to deal with it. And it was because someone made sure it didn't go anywhere." Gretchen's voice had a quality in it that Nora recognized, not grief exactly, more like the specific adult exhaustion of finding out that something you hoped was indifference was actually something worse. "How long has he been feeding them information?" "The federal agents will figure that out." "I'm asking you." "Gretchen." Nora looked at her directly. "I don't know. And right now I need to finish this chart and check on the woman in Bay 4 whose blood pressure has been trending up for the past 2 hours and is not going to care about any of this when I walk in there." Gretchen breathed out. "Right," she said. "Right. Go." Nora went. The woman in Bay 4 was named Sadie, 67 years old, admitted for a hypertensive episode, and she had the particular quality of patients who had been in the medical system long enough to be done being impressed by it. She was watching a cooking competition on the Bay television with the focused engagement of someone who had made a deliberate decision about where to put her attention, and when Nora came in, she looked up briefly and then back at the screen. "Your numbers are up again," Nora said, pulling the rolling stool over. "I heard people in the hallway a while ago." "There was some activity. Everything's fine." "Is the cafeteria open?" "Not yet. I can get you something from the nutrition cart." Sadie looked at her, at the dressing on her neck, at whatever was showing in her face despite her best efforts. "You look like you had a harder morning than me," she said. "Different kind of hard." Nora checked the monitor readings and made a note. "I'm going to adjust your medication timing. I want to see where you are in an hour before we talk to the attending." "Okay," Sadie said. She looked back at the cooking competition. Then, "You doing all right, honey?" The question was so ordinary and so unexpected that Nora didn't have a prepared response for it. She sat on the stool for a second and thought about it honestly. "I will be," she said. "I think." "That's usually the best you can say," Sadie said, with the conviction of someone speaking from substantial experience. Nora adjusted the medication timing, documented it, and moved on. At 12:30, Ward found her in the supply room doing an inventory she had technically been supposed to do 2 days ago. He closed the door behind him, which was not standard behavior for a man entering a room where a female staff member was working alone, and she appreciated that he acknowledged it by leaving 6 feet between them and keeping the door handle visible. "Dillard's talking," he said. "How much?" "Enough. He's been on the Valdez payroll for 14 months. His primary function was access, pull, patient placement information, security schedules, staff rotations. They used him to identify which windows the hospital's coverage was thin, which shifts had the least security redundancy. He paused. He flagged Escobar's admission within 2 hours of intake. Nora set down the supply clipboard. The medication log complaint. He buried it, yes. Used his administrative access to reclassify it as resolved. 3 of the supporting witnesses were contacted directly. We don't have details yet, but we think pressure was applied. Meaning he threatened people. That's the working theory. She thought about 3 nurses who had backed off from supporting her complaint. She had assumed it was the ordinary institutional calculus, the math of risk versus benefit that most people ran and most people resolved in favor of not making things harder for themselves. Maybe some of them had made that calculation genuinely. Maybe some of them had been given reasons that made the calculation much simpler. The woman from medical records, she said. What's her name? Paula Ferris. 14 years at Harlan Vale. She's the one who pulled the false record this morning and relayed it up the chain. Who did she relay it to? Ward's expression shifted slightly. Not discomfort, but precision. He was selecting what to tell her. That's the part that's developing. The architect. We have a communication chain. Ferris sent an encrypted message to a number we've been tracking as a dead end for 8 months. This morning, when she accessed the false record and passed the information, that number became active. He paused. Whoever it is, they responded. They made a call. To who? To someone we can trace now. The call is being run as we speak. He looked at her steadily. This is why I came to find you. Within the next 2 to 4 hours, we're going to have an identification. When we do, there are going to be federal arrest actions and the associated media presence and the general situation that comes with that. This building is going to know what happened. He paused. I want you to be prepared for what that looks like. I'm a nurse. I deal with bad news regularly. This is specific to you, he said. Dillard gave a statement about the complaint you filed. He confirmed he suppressed it deliberately, and he identified by name the individuals he pressured into withdrawing their support. He looked at her with the directness she had come to associate with him. Not gentle, not harsh, just accurate. You were right. On record, with documentation. Everything you filed 4 years ago and everything since then is going to be reviewed. She didn't say anything for a moment. She had been right. She had known she was right, had filed the complaint knowing she was right, had watched it go nowhere for 4 years, and had not stopped working or stopped filing or stopped being correct in the quiet, ongoing, tedious way of someone who did not have the option of stopping. And now she was being told that the record would reflect that. She didn't know exactly how she felt about it. Something was moving in her chest that wasn't satisfaction, or wasn't only that. Something that had more weight to it, the specific gravity of 4 years of carrying something you had been told wasn't real. Okay, she said. That's it? What do you want me to say? He looked at her for a moment. Nothing, he said. That's probably the right answer. He turned toward the door. Stay available. I'll be in touch. Ward. He paused with his hand on the door. The architect. When you identify them, it's not going to be someone obvious, is it? He was quiet for a beat. No, he said. It usually isn't. He left. She went back to the supply inventory because it needed to be done, and the ordinary continuation of work was the only honest response she had to any of this. And she was 2/3 through the list when her radio crackled with a call from Bay 2 that needed her attention, and she put down the clipboard and went. The afternoon unfolded in that particular doubled register. The clinical surface, moving steadily, patients and charts, and the rotation of need that defined the department. And underneath it, the subterranean current of the federal operation pulling information through its channels somewhere above her in the building, through servers and communication records, and the slow assembly of a case that had been building for over a year. She was aware of both layers simultaneously. It was not comfortable, but it was manageable, and manageable was what she had. At 2:47, her phone buzzed. Ward. We have him. She read it twice. Then she put the phone in her pocket and continued the med pass she was in the middle of, because a patient's afternoon medications did not negotiate with federal timelines. She found out the details incrementally, the way you found things out in an active investigation. Pieces. Not the whole, each piece requiring interpretation. Pacheco came through the ER at 3:15 and spoke briefly with Ward near the entrance, and from the quality of their body language, the compact charged communication of people who had just confirmed something large, Nora could read that the identification had come through and that it mattered in the specific way that suggested proximity rather than distance. Ward came to her at 3:30. He didn't take her to a conference room this time. He stood at the edge of the supply alcove off the main corridor and spoke quietly and directly, which she had come to understand was the way he handled information that didn't have a comfortable container. "The architect is a man named Voss," he said. And then he stopped because of what that name was. Nora felt the blood go out of her face. "Not related to you," Ward said immediately. "I need to say that first. We checked the moment the name came up. There is no connection." He waited for her to process this. His name is Gerald Voss. He runs a private security and consulting firm called Meridian Protective Services, based in Marin City. He's been contracting with hospital networks for 11 years. System security audits, access protocol reviews, vulnerability assessments. He's worked with 14 hospitals in 3 states. She understood the scope of it before he finished the sentence. He identified the vulnerabilities, she said, and then sold the access. He would conduct his audit, map the internal systems, document the human weak points, staff who were financially stretched, individuals with histories that could be leveraged, and then pass that information to the Valdez network. They would make contact with the identified individuals on their own. Dillard was one. Ferris was one. There are others across the other hospitals. He paused. Harlan Vale commissioned an access security audit from Meridian Protective Services 18 months ago. 14 months was when Dillard had gone on the payroll. "He used my name," Nora said. Not quite a statement, not quite a question. "He named his company Meridian. He named himself Voss. We don't know if the surname was deliberate or coincidental. It's common enough." Ward's voice was careful. "But it meant that any preliminary name search in our early investigation returned your record alongside his, which created noise in the data and slowed the identification." He paused again. "It may have been deliberate." She sat with that. The possibility that someone had structured their operational cover around a shared name with a nurse in an emergency department, not targeting her specifically, but using the coincidence of a common surname to muddy digital searches. It was the kind of thing that was either clever or random, and in Nora's experience, the two were often indistinguishable until you had all the information. "Where is he now?" Federal agents executed an arrest warrant at his office in Marin City at 2:15 this afternoon. He's in custody. Ward looked at her. "He had a drive. Encrypted, but we have people who handle that. The full scope of the operation, all 14 hospitals, every individual he identified and sold, will be in there." "He's the architect," Nora said. "He's not going to give you anything voluntarily." "He doesn't need to. We have the communication chain, we have Ferris's cooperation, and we have Dillard's statement. The drive is supporting evidence." Ward's voice had settled into something that was almost but not quite satisfaction. "It's enough." She leaned against the wall of the alcove and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The fluorescent above her was the same one that had been flickering for 2 days and still hadn't been fixed. She made a mental note to submit the facility's request a 3rd time, which she would do because she was someone who submitted facilities requests and filed complaints and did the paperwork even when the paperwork went nowhere, because eventually it went somewhere. "There's a press situation developing," Ward said. "The arrests are going to generate coverage. Harlan Vale is going to be named. The story of what happened in the cafeteria yesterday is going to come out." "I'm not talking to press," Nora said. "Nobody's asking you to, but the hospital board is convening tomorrow morning, and I've been asked to brief them on the full sequence of events, including your actions." He said it carefully. "Your name is going to be in that briefing." "I was just working," she said. "I know that's how you see it." "That's how it was." He was quiet for a moment. "There's something else. The board is going to be reviewing personnel actions that were taken or not taken during the period when Dillard had access to administrative systems. The complaint you filed, the records that were suppressed. There are apparently other staff members who had similar experiences during this period that were buried in the same way." He paused. That review is going to result in some formal findings. She didn't ask what the findings would say. She already knew, in the way you knew something when the evidence had been clear for a long time and the only variable was whether anyone was ever going to look at it seriously. "Okay," she said. "You keep saying that." "It keeps being the right answer." He almost smiled. She caught it at the edges before it resolved into his standard expression. "Get some sleep tonight," he said. "Tomorrow is going to be long." He left, and she stood in the alcove for another minute, and then she went back to the floor and worked until the end of her shift. That evening, Caldwell City News ran a 3-paragraph breaking item about federal arrests connected to an organized crime investigation, mentioning Harlan Vale Medical Center by name and describing a hostage situation the previous day as part of an ongoing federal case. By morning, it had grown into something considerably larger, because the arrest of Gerald Voss, whose firm had contracted with hospital networks across 3 states, had the shape of a story that generated its own momentum: public safety, institutional betrayal, a criminal network that had used the access of a trusted contractor to place informants inside medical facilities. The morning briefing started at 7. Nora was not in them. She was on the ER floor, where the volume was slightly lower than usual because several of the overnight staff had called in citing stress, reasonable under the circumstances, and where Gretchen had come in an hour early and not said anything about it, just arrived and started working, which was the purest expression of who she was. At 9:15, Pacheco appeared in the doorway with a woman Nora didn't know. Late 40s, professional, the particular bearing of someone who managed things for a living. "Nora Voss?" the woman said. "Yes." "I'm Carla Hines. I'm serving as interim hospital administrator pending the board's selection process." She extended a hand. "Do you have a few minutes?" Nora had, by this point, developed a standard response to being asked if she had a few minutes by people who carried themselves like Carla Hines. "Yes," she said, "but I need to be back on the floor by 9:30. This will take 5. They used the same consultation room with the lake painting and the box of tissues, which was beginning to feel like Nora's personal meeting room. Hines sat, and Pacheco stood near the door in her customary position, and Nora sat and waited. "The board met this morning," Hines said. "An emergency session. Council was present. I want to be transparent with you about some of what was discussed." She folded her hands on the table. "The personnel file review that's underway has identified 7 separate complaints or incident reports that were improperly classified or suppressed during the period when Mr. Dillard had unauthorized access to administrative systems. Yours was the most recent, but not the only one." She paused. "The board has voted to formally reinstate each of those complaints with full documentation and to initiate a review process to determine what corrective actions should have been taken at the time." "What does that mean practically?" "It means your complaint is on record as filed and unresolved. Any formal finding from this point forward reflects that you raised a legitimate concern that was improperly handled, and that the handling was not a reflection of the merits of your complaint." Nora looked at the lake painting. Whoever had painted it had made the water slightly too blue, a decision that she had never thought about before and was now very aware of. "What happened to the nurses who withdrew their supporting statements?" she said. Hines paused. "That's still being determined. We believe at least 2 of them were subject to inappropriate pressure from Mr. Dillard." She said it carefully, which meant the liability implications were still being sorted. "Anyone who comes forward with information about that will be supported." You should reach out to them directly," Nora said. "Don't wait for them to come to you. Some people don't come forward because they've learned that coming forward doesn't help them." Hines held her gaze. "That's fair," she said. "I'll make sure that happens." There was a pause. Something else was sitting in the room that hadn't been said yet, and Nora could feel it the way you could feel weather. "The federal briefing this morning," Hines said, "included a detailed account of events during the cafeteria incident yesterday and the subsequent situation on the 3rd floor. She stopped. "I want to say, on behalf of the institution, that we failed you. The environment that allowed what happened to happen, the suppression, the access, the compromise of this department, that's an institutional failure. Whatever we determine was appropriate action on your complaint 4 years ago, you should not have had to keep working in a department where the person who buried your complaint was your charge nurse." Nora didn't say anything for a moment. The words were correct. They were, in fact, everything she had wanted to hear for 4 years, delivered in the correct order with the correct institutional weight behind them, and she felt them land somewhere she had been keeping sealed. "Thank you," she said. She stood up. "I need to get back to my patients." She was at the door when Hines said, "Miss Voss?" She paused. "There will be a formal statement from the board later today. Your name will be in it with the board's acknowledgement. I wanted you to hear it from me first before it went to the public." Nora nodded once. She went back to the ER. The floor at 935 was what the floor was always, a contained, ongoing emergency with good people running it. She checked in with Gretchen, pulled 2 charts, went to Bay 3 where a 17-year-old with a sports injury was trying very hard not to let his mother see that his eyes were wet, and she sat with them and did the work. At 11:40, her phone buzzed. It was Ward. "Something you should know, Voss's drive decrypted. Full contact list across all 14 hospitals, total of 23 individuals identified and sold. We're moving on all of them simultaneously." A pause, and then, "One name on the list we didn't expect. Not a hospital employee. Someone on the contractor side who worked with Dillard before Harlan Vale. The name is Reeves." She didn't recognize the name. She texted back, "Who is Reeves?" A longer pause than usual. Then Ward's answer came through, and Nora read it twice, and the third time she read it, the full shape of it became clear. Reeves was the name of the security company that had conducted Harlan Vale's previous access audit, not the Meridian audit 18 months ago, but the one 7 years before that. The one that had been completed and filed and that no one had looked at again, because 7-year-old audit documentation didn't get reviewed unless you had a specific reason. The one that had been completed 6 months after Nora left the Army. The one whose lead auditor had flagged a staff member in a forward-deployed military medical unit as a potential security risk. Not Nora, but someone she had worked alongside, someone whose access to medical records and patient location data had been noted and then apparently passed somewhere it should never have gone. 7 years ago. She stood in the corridor outside Bay 3 and read the message 3 times, and understood that the thing she had been carrying without knowing she was carrying it, the specific weight of a coincidence that had never felt entirely like coincidence, had a name now, and the name was not Gerald Voss, and it was not Dillard, and it was not anyone she had identified in the past 48 hours. It was older than all of them, and somewhere in Declan Ward's encrypted drive was the documentation that connected a 7-year-old security audit to a 14-month-old hospital infiltration, and the thread that ran between them passed through a forward surgical team on a road outside a town in a country that didn't appear on civilian maps, and through a burning vehicle, and through the specific night when Nora had gone back in for a 3rd time because she thought there might be someone else. She texted Ward, "I need to see that audit." His reply came back in under 30 seconds. "I know. Come to the 3rd floor when you can. Bring coffee." She stopped at the vending machine on the 2nd floor and bought 2 coffees and paper cups that were going to be bad by any reasonable standard, and she carried them up the stairs and down the administrative corridor and knocked on the door of 3C with her elbow because her hands were full. Ward opened it. He took one of the cups without comment and sat back down at the table, where a laptop was open next to a printed document that was thick enough to have required a dedicated staple. The audit. Nora sat across from him and looked at the cover page. Reeves Security Consulting, Operational Vulnerability Assessment, Forward Surgical Team Delta. 7, classified. A date, 7 years and 4 months ago. She had been in country at the time, 8 weeks into her 2nd deployment, working out of a facility that was not a facility in the official sense, a repurposed structure staffed by people whose names and functions existed in documentation she had never been allowed to read. "Walk me through it," she said. Ward turned the document so she could read it and kept his coffee in both hands. Reeves Security Consulting was a private firm contracted by a defense logistics subsidiary to conduct vulnerability assessments on forward support units. Standard stuff on paper. Identify access risks, flag personnel who might be security concerns, recommend protocol improvements. He paused. What they were actually doing was selling the assessments, not the full reports. The personnel flags specifically. Any individual identified as a potential weak point, someone with debt, someone with family complications, someone who had exhibited behavior that could be leveraged, That person's file went to a secondary buyer. Valdez, Nora said. Valdez was one. There were others. Reeves operated for 6 years before they dissolved the firm. By then the damage was distributed enough that nobody connected it. He looked at the document. The flag in Delta 7's assessment was not you. I want to be clear about that. I know, she said. You said. The flag was a logistics coordinator named Pruitt. He had gambling debts, significant ones, and Reeves noted them. Pruitt handled supply chain documentation for the unit, which included medical supply manifests that listed patient load and location data in aggregate. He paused again. Pruitt was separated from service 2 months after the assessment. We don't have a complete record of what he did after that. What we do have is a financial thread that connects a shell account in his name to a Valdez subsidiary account, active from approximately 5 years ago until 8 months ago when the account went dormant. He was feeding them, Nora said, from inside the contracting chain. Historical data mostly, old unit records, personnel files that hadn't been properly archived and destroyed, the kind of background information that lets you build a map of who served where and with whom. Ward set down his coffee. That's how Voss found Dillard. Dillard served as a contracted medical technician with a joint support unit that overlapped with Delta 7's operational area 2 years after your deployment. His file was in the Pruitt dataset. Voss acquired it, ran his own assessment on Dillard, identified him as viable, and when Meridian got the Harlan Vale contract, Dillard was already on his list. Nora sat with this for a moment. The shape of it was large. Not just what had happened in the past 48 hours, not just the cafeteria and the third-floor corridor and the alley behind the administrative wing, but the longer shape behind it. A security firm that had sold personnel vulnerabilities. A logistics coordinator with gambling debts. A chain of acquisition and use that had run for years before it produced 2 armed men in a hospital cafeteria on an ordinary Thursday morning. Pruitt, she said, where is he now? Federal custody as of this morning. He's the 24th arrest in a 48-hour window. Ward looked at her. He'll cooperate. He doesn't have the profile of someone who holds out. He got in over his head a long time ago and kept going because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. That's usually how it works, she said. Yes. Ward was quiet for a moment. The connection to your deployment was incidental. Pruitt's dataset included hundreds of personnel files. Yours was in there because you were assigned to Delta 7. It's how Voss knew your name was associated with the unit, which is why, we believe, he used it as his personal alias. Not targeting you. Using a familiar-sounding surname from existing data to create operational cover. She nodded slowly. She had already arrived at this conclusion, but hearing it confirmed by someone who had done the actual investigative work settled something she hadn't realized was still unsettled. It had not been personal. It had never been personal. It had been the specific, impersonal cruelty of a system that treated people as data points to be monetized. And she had been a data point in a file in a database that someone had sold, and the downstream consequence of that transaction had followed her across 7 years and 2,000 miles, and arrived in her emergency department on a Wednesday morning wearing the face of a problem she could solve. There was a certain dark logic to it that she didn't find comforting, but she found it honest. What happens now? She said. Not a question about the case. Ward seemed to understand that. Gerald Voss faces federal charges across 3 states. RICO, conspiracy, obstruction, accessory to attempted murder for the cafeteria incident. His firm's assets are frozen. The 14 hospitals he assessed are under federal review. Every individual he identified and sold, 23 people across 4 years, their files are being reviewed for coercion evidence, because some of them may have been pressured in ways that mitigate their culpability. He paused. Dillard is cooperating and will receive consideration for it. Ferris is cooperating, Pruitt will cooperate. Tolliver is the only one still holding out, and that position will become untenable when his counsel reviews what we have. And Escobar, she said. Ramon Escobar is alive, stable, and in a secure location outside Caldwell City. His testimony is intact. The federal case against the Valdez leadership goes to trial in 4 months. Ward looked at her across the table. Because of what you did in that cafeteria, he's still alive to testify. I didn't know who he was. No, Ward said. That's the part that matters. She drank some of the bad coffee. It was bad the way she had expected it to be. Declan, she said, which was the first time she had used his first name, and she saw him register it. The commendation citation, the one that's sealed. Does it stay sealed? He considered this. That's not my decision. It's a military determination. But I can tell you that the briefing I gave to the Federal Oversight Committee this morning referenced the citation in context, and those briefings are not sealed. He paused. People who want to know what you did 7 years ago will be able to find it. I'm not asking for it to be public. I know. He looked at her steadily. I'm telling you it won't be a secret anymore. That's different. She thought about the shoebox in the back of her closet, the commendations she had put away not out of shame. She had never felt shame about her service, but out of the particular discipline of someone who had learned that the past was most useful as information rather than identity. You did the work. You filed it. You moved on to the next work. The problem was that sometimes the past didn't stay filed. There's going to be a press conference, Ward said. The federal office is handling it. Your name will come up. I can't prevent that. I know. You can prepare a statement if you want. You don't have to speak. But if there's something you want on record about your experience at Harlan Vale, the suppressed complaint, the working conditions, now is the time for that to be part of the official account. She thought about what she would want on record. She thought about Gretchen coming in an hour early without saying anything. She thought about Marcus crouching behind the serving counter because a stranger in scrubs had given him a hand signal he shouldn't have understood, and he had understood it anyway. She thought about Sadie and Bay 4 asking if she was doing all right, honey, and the specific weight of being asked a real question by someone who expected a real answer. What I want on record, she said, is that this hospital has good people in it. Whatever happened at the administrative level, whatever Dillard did, the people who work this floor, who have been working it through 48 hours of this, deserve to be part of whatever statement goes out. Ward nodded. I'll make sure that's in there. She stood up. I have a shift to finish, Sam. The press conference happened at 4 o'clock that afternoon in the Caldwell City Federal Building, which was on the other side of town from Harlan Vale, and which Nora watched on her phone in the nurses' station break room during the 12 minutes she was not actively needed on the floor. The federal spokesperson covered the arrests in order. Gerald Voss and Meridian Protective Services, Brecht Tolliver, Paula Ferris, Marcus Dillard, Lyle Pruitt, and the remaining 19 individuals across the other 13 hospitals. She described the structure of the operation with the careful specificity of someone who had been well briefed. The vulnerability assessment sold as intelligence, the personnel flags converted to recruitment targets, the long-running infiltration of medical facilities across the region. She used the word systematic twice and deliberate once, and both were accurate. Then she described Harlan Vale on Wednesday morning, the 2 individuals sent to locate and eliminate a protected federal witness. The hospital staff, the cafeteria. She described, briefly and without dramatization, a nurse who had kept 23 people from serious harm during an active hostage situation, who had facilitated the safe relocation of the witness, and who had subsequently assisted in the identification of an inside contact on the 3rd floor. She identified Nora by name. She also read, verbatim, a 3-sentence statement from the Harlan Vale Board acknowledging the suppression of internal complaints during the period of Dillard's influence, affirming that those complaints were now being fully investigated and committing to a formal review process. 3 sentences. Nora had written them at Ward's suggestion, in the consultation room with the lake painting, at noon, in about 4 minutes, and they were not elegant sentences, but they were accurate ones. Gretchen watched the last 2 minutes of the press conference on her own phone from the doorway of the break room and then came in and sat down. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You wrote that statement." "Yes." "You could have said more." "That was enough." Gretchen looked at her. 4 years, she said. "You filed that complaint 4 years ago and kept coming to work every shift under the person who buried it." "I needed the job," Nora said, "and the patients needed nurses. That's not the only reason." Nora thought about whether Gretchen was right. She probably was. There was a stubbornness in Nora that was not exactly pride and not exactly principle, but something in between. a refusal to be moved from a position she had taken by people who had decided she was wrong for reasons that had nothing to do with whether she was actually wrong. She had not left because leaving felt like conceding something she was not willing to concede. That was not heroic. It was, if she was honest about it, a form of obstinacy. But she had also stayed because the work mattered, and that was also true. Both things, she said. Gretchen nodded, in the way of someone who found this answer imprecise but sufficient. What happens now? With the complaint review. With Dillard's position. That's the board's process. I'm not involved in it. You should be. I filed the complaint. That's my involvement. What they do with it is their job. She stood up. I need to get back to the floor. Nora. Gretchen's voice caught her at the door. Not loud, just with enough weight to stop her. For what it's worth, and I know it doesn't fix 4 years, I should have backed you harder when you filed that thing. I thought it was going to go through channels, and I didn't push when it didn't. Nora turned and looked at her. Gretchen was not someone who apologized often or carelessly. I know, Nora said. I know you would have if you'd understood what was happening with it. That's generous. It's accurate. She paused. We're good, Gretchen. She went back to the floor. Ward came to the ER at 6 in the evening, an hour before the end of her shift. He came in quietly and found her at the workstation and stood a few feet away until she had finished what she was typing. When she looked up, he said, Escobar asked about you. She waited. He knows what happened. He wanted me to pass on. He said it specifically. That he didn't take it for granted. What you did. He knows you didn't do it for him. How is he? Medically stable? Scared? He's going to have to testify in front of people who would prefer he didn't, and he knows what that costs. Ward paused. But he's going to do it. Good, Nora said. Ward was quiet for a moment. He looked like someone who had more to say and was choosing whether to say it. She had enough experience with him now to let him choose at his own pace. I've been running operations for a long time, he said finally. I've worked with a lot of people in a lot of conditions. Most of them had training, equipment, team structure, communications. You had a cafeteria. He paused. I want you to know I'm going to carry Wednesday with me for a while. Not as something I'm proud of. I didn't do it, but as a reminder of what it looks like when someone does the work in front of them without waiting for permission or resources or the right conditions. She looked at him for a moment. You carried a burning vehicle with you for 7 years, she said. I think you're going to be okay. He almost smiled again. This time it got slightly further before he brought it back. If you ever want to do something other than emergency nursing, he said, there are people I can talk to. I know, she said. This is where I want to be. He nodded like this was the answer he had expected. He offered his hand. She shook it, which felt slightly formal given everything, and he seemed to think so too because the handshake was brief, and then he said, take care of yourself, and left. She went back to work for the last hour of her shift. The board's formal review took 11 days. In that time, the federal case developments generated coverage in 3 regional papers and 2 national outlets, which produced the particular phenomenon of a story that was both bigger and smaller than what had actually happened. Bigger in the telling, smaller in the human detail. Nora was described in most of them as a former Army nurse who had diffused a hostage situation. One got it more or less right and described her as a staff nurse who had used the resources available to her to keep people safe. She preferred that version, not because it was more flattering, it wasn't, but because it was accurate. At the end of the 11 days, the board's review produced a formal finding. Every suppressed complaint from the Dillard period was reinstated with full documentation. 3 of the 4 nurses who had withdrawn supporting statements came forward during the review period and provided accounts of the pressure they had received. The 4th submitted a written statement through counsel. The finding described a pattern of intimidation enabled by Dillard's administrative access and recommended remediation, including a formal apology to each affected staff member, a review of the department's complaint processes, and the appointment of an independent ombudsperson for personnel matters. Marcus Dillard was formally terminated and permanently barred from clinical practice pending the outcome of the federal charges against him, which included obstruction and conspiracy counts that his cooperation deal reduced but did not eliminate. He would not be practicing nursing again. Brecht Tolliver was charged with 11 federal counts. He took a plea on 7 of them. His sentence recommendation included mandatory restitution to the hospital and a minimum of 4 years of federal imprisonment, which his attorney was fighting, but which the prosecutor's office considered a floor, not a ceiling. Gerald Voss, the architect, went to trial 7 months later on RICO charges, conspiracy, and multiple counts of accessory to violence across the 14 hospitals. His attorneys argued that Meridian's assessments were consulting documents with no criminal intent. The federal prosecutor presented 3,100 pages of communications, financial records, and testimony from 12 cooperating witnesses, including Paula Ferris, who took the stand for 2 days and described in precise and damaging detail the process by which Voss had converted his security audits into operational intelligence for organized crime. The jury deliberated for 11 hours and returned guilty verdicts on 19 of 22 counts. Voss received a sentence of 23 years. The Valdez trial was separate later and built on Escobar's testimony along with the 2 years of prior investigative work. Nora did not follow it closely. She heard the outcome from Ward in a brief text message 8 months after the events at Harlan Vale. Valdez leadership convicted. All counts. Thought you should know. She texted back, good. And then she put her phone in her pocket and finished her shift. The morning of the board's formal apology was a Tuesday in late October, 6 weeks after everything. The ceremony, if you could call it that, was held in the main conference room on the second floor, not the administrative wing, because somebody had made a thoughtful decision about symbolism. The affected staff members had been individually notified and individually invited, and it had been made clear that attendance was not required and that the formal apology would be delivered in writing regardless of whether anyone showed up in person. Nora almost didn't go. She had work. She had 4 patients, a medication review, and a supply audit she had rescheduled twice. She stood at the ER entrance at 8:45 with her badge in her hand and thought about whether the thing she needed from an institutional apology was the institutional version of it, delivered in a conference room with the board present and counsel at the table, or whether she had already received what she needed from the sequence of events that had produced this morning. She thought about the construction worker named Dove, who had called his wife from Bay 1 with a nail in his palm and had cried a little on the phone when he thought nobody was listening. She thought about Sadie asking if she was doing all right, honey. She thought about Marcus crouching behind the serving counter with 2 strangers following his lead because a woman in scrubs had moved her hand in a way that meant stay down and stay safe. She went. The conference room was not full, but it was not empty either. 6 of the 7 affected staff were present. Gretchen was there, seated near the window, who nodded once when Nora came in. The board was arranged at one end of the table, and Carla Hines read the formal finding aloud, which took 8 minutes, and the language was careful and institutional and correct. And at the end of it, she looked up from the document and said something that was not in the written text. I want to say something that's not in the finding, Hines said. The finding covers what happened and what should have happened and what we're going to do differently. It doesn't cover how it felt to work here during this period, and it can't, because that's not what formal findings do. She looked at the people at the table. You kept doing the work, under conditions that were unfair and sometimes hostile, with a complaints process that had been deliberately corrupted. You kept showing up, and you kept doing the job. The patients in this building were safe because of that, even when this institution did not deserve the people providing that safety. She paused. I can't give you those 4 years back. I can't make what Dillard did not matter. What I can tell you is that this board sees what you did and what you kept doing, and it matters. The room was quiet for a moment. Nora looked at the table, the wood grain, the specific nothing of looking at a surface while you process something. She had been told she was right before. Ward had told her. Pacheco had confirmed it. The federal record reflected it. But those were external validations of a thing she had always known. This was different. This was the institution that had failed her saying, "We failed you," out loud, in front of witnesses. and it landed differently than she had expected. Not as vindication, she had that already, but as something smaller and more ordinary, as being seen. She was not going to cry in a board meeting. She had a solid and reliable track record of not crying in professional settings, which she intended to maintain. She looked out the window instead at the parking structure and the overcast October sky above it, and she breathed steadily, and after a moment the thing in her chest settled back into something manageable. After the meeting, she was in the corridor outside waiting for the elevator when Ward appeared from the direction of the stairwell. He was not in his usual jacket. He had a coat instead, the kind that meant he was traveling. He stopped when he saw her. "You came," he said. "I almost didn't." "I know, I was watching the door." She looked at the coat. "You're leaving." "Marin City. There's a debrief on the Voss trial, and then we start building the next phase of the Valdez case." He paused. "It doesn't stop." "No," she said. "It doesn't." He was quiet for a moment in the way she had learned meant he was choosing something from a longer version of what he wanted to say. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said finally. "You went back into the vehicle 7 years ago. You didn't know there was nobody else in there. You went back because you couldn't be sure." She remembered it, the heat, the secondary fire starting at the rear, the decision that was not really a decision, just the next action in a sequence of actions, none of which she had stopped to evaluate. "I would have done it either way," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what I keep thinking about." The elevator arrived. She held it with her hand on the door. "Declan." He looked at her. "When you find the next one, the next vulnerable place, the next person who got in over their head and kept going, try to find out early whether there was pressure, before you classify them." He held her gaze. "I'll try," he said. "Not always possible." "No," she said. "But try." She got on the elevator. The doors closed. She went back to the ER. Tom. The shift that day was a long one. She covered for someone who called out sick at noon and stayed 3 hours past her scheduled end time. And by the time she walked out to the parking structure at 7:15, the sky had gone fully dark, and the industrial smell from the freight yards was heavier in the cold air. She sat in her car for a minute, not with the engine off. She was cold and she started it, but with the seat still, going nowhere yet. She thought about the shoebox in her closet. She had opened it the previous weekend for the first time in 2 years, not out of nostalgia, but because she had needed to see what was in there clearly. The commendations were there, 3 of them, with their formal language and their sealed citations. They said what they said. She was not going to put them on the wall, and she was not going to throw them away, and she was not going to keep carrying them in a shoebox like something she was ashamed of. She drove home, and when she got there, she put the shoebox on the kitchen shelf next to the medical reference texts and the weights she actually used, where she could see it without having to look for it. There is a particular kind of person who operates best when nobody is watching. Who does the work at full capacity regardless of whether anyone is going to notice, files the complaint even when the complaint goes nowhere, goes back into the burning vehicle because there might be someone in there and you will not know until you check. This kind of person is not rare. They are in every hospital, every school, every unremarkable building where important things happen quietly. But they are easy to miss because they do not announce themselves, and they do not require acknowledgement to continue. The danger is in mistaking their silence for weakness, in assuming that because they are not asking for recognition, they do not deserve it, or that because they are still functioning, they are not carrying something heavy, or that because they filed a complaint and it went nowhere, they must have been wrong about it. The people who make this mistake often do so for a long time, and they often stop other people from correcting it, and the cost of that is distributed and diffused and shows up in the people who keep working inside institutions that have failed them, doing the job at full capacity, waiting for the structure around them to become honest. Nora Voss had waited 4 years for the structure to become honest, and it had taken a federal investigation and 2 armed men in a cafeteria to make it happen, which was not efficient and was not fair, and was also, in the end, sufficient. She made rice and eggs at 8 and ate at the counter and went to bed at 10. At 5:45 the next morning, her alarm went off. She got up, she dressed. She drove to Harlan Vale in the dark, parked in the structure, walked through the ER entrance, clocked in, and picked up the first chart of the day. The work was there. It was always there. She got started.